Dear students, I welcome you all to my today's session, which is on Introduction to Classical Sociological Thought, and I will be talking about the works of Karl Marx in this lecture. Karl Marx is celebrated as one of the most remembered names of the 19th century Europe and somebody who left a lasting legacy on social science in general and sociology in particular. He is also one of the most debated theorists, and his body of thought has been either vehemently agreed upon or rejected by scholars from different theoretical traditions till this day. Throughout his life, Marx actively associated himself with communist politics, and it was his ideology and commitment to socialism and communism that actually drove his theoretical works. While his works span across a range of disciplines such as sociology, philosophy, history, economics, etc., Marx undoubtedly remains most celebrated social thinkers of the 19th century. I will talk about his biography briefly. He was born in Trier in Prussia in a family of rabbi, that is, Jewish priests. However, his father converted to Protestantism, and he was from a family of comfortable economic standing, his father being a lawyer, and after finishing school he studied at the University of Bonn and then in the University of Berlin. It was in Berlin University that Marx learned about Hegel, a figure who had a lasting impression on him and influence many of his fundamental concepts. And it was in Berlin University that he came across this group of philosophers known as the Young Hegelians, which was a radical group, and they were mainly concerned with a critique of religion. And as you know, that Marx was an atheist throughout his life. For the most part of his life, in terms of his professional life, he worked as a journalist, and he never held any academic position in academic institution. And because of his radical activities, he had to keep moving from one country to another throughout his life, and the cities that he stayed in would include the cities of Paris, Brussels, Cologne, and finally London, where he spent the last part of his life. With that short introduction about his life, I now actually talk about the contributions of Marx and focus on three important areas of his contribution. These are historical materialism, capitalism, his notion of capitalism, and his notion of class and class struggle. To begin with historical materialism. What is historical materialism? Historical materialism, or the materialist conception of history, is a philosophy and method of Marxism. Marx believed that history progresses in predictable stages of socioeconomic systems, wherein in each stage it is the economy which shapes the rest of the social institutions, such as political institutions, cultural institutions, legal institutions, and so on and so forth. So, the basic argument of Marx's historical materialism is that the way in which people provide for their material needs determines and shapes the conditions of relations between people and shapes all social institutions. So basically, in Marx's theory, the realm of production, the economic realm, is central to understanding entire society and all other social institutions. Marx's view of history was essentially a dynamic one. And he therefore believed that the forces of production would eventually change to better provide for material needs. So basically, his idea of economy is based on two concepts: the forces of production and the relations of production. According to Marx, the economy is determined by a definite mode of production, which consists of the forces of production, which in turn corresponds to a definite relations of production. The means or the forces of production comprise of the tools, the machinery, the factories, etc., which are used to satisfy basic human needs. The relations of production are the kinds of associations that people enter with each other in satisfying these basic needs. So Marx believed that the means of production and the forces of production change for the better. And with such changes, the existing relations of production would also change. And ultimately, this will lead to a whole new social system. The new social system, according to Marx, will emerge out of the contradiction and conflict between the forces of production and the relations of production. To give an example which will make this concept clear, the emergence of new technology of production and the factory system, which emerged as a result of Industrial Revolution in Europe, forced the existing feudal relations to change into a new economic relation, which is the capitalist system. So basically, the feudal lords who derived their wealth solely from the ownership of land and who felt a moral obligation to provide for their serfs had to be replaced by capitalists. Capitalists who derived their wealth from capital. That is, the ownership of capital was most important for the class of capitalist. And these capitalists felt no moral obligation to provide for the wage laborers who they employed and whose labor they bought. Now, Marx talks about certain stages of human history, and he mentions 5 major stages of social evolution based on the changes in the mode of production. These are primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and finally, socialism and communism. The distinctive feature of primitive communism was that there was no notion of private property. However, subsequently the notion of private ownership emerged, and each of the stages of slave society and feudalism are marked by the rise of 2 antagonistic classes in each of these epochs: the slave master and the slaves in slave society, and the feudal lords and serfs in feudal society. The capitalistic stage is marked by the emergence of free labor, and this makes it distinctive, the emergence of free labor. And in the capitalist stage, what we see is the emergence of ownership of capital instead of the ownership of land, which was the distinctive feature of feudalism. The 2 basic classes in capitalist society are the capitalists and the proletariat. Marx believed that the ensuing conflict between the capitalists and the proletariat will push for the next stage of social evolution, but this time through a revolution. The revolution will be led by the proletariat, and ultimately it will lead to the emergence of socialist societies. The socialist society would be marked by the state ownership of resources and thereby signaling the end of class society. The final phase of communism, envisioned by Marx as the penultimate stage of social evolution, is marked by the abolition of the state. Marx essentially saw state as an instrument of class oppression, and hence, with the abolition of the state, will emerge a classless society in the true sense of the term, which is the phase of communism. This is how Marx envisioned the stages of social evolution through his explication of the theory of historical materialism. Now I move over to the second part of my discussion, which is on his notion of capitalism. Essentially, the entire gamut of Marx's work is a critique of capitalism. What distinguishes capitalist society from other types of society, according to Marx, is a social production here takes the form of generalized production of commodities, that is, production of commodities mediated by the market. So what is this notion of commodity production that he talks about in case of capitalism? One of the most important characteristics of capitalism, as I said, is commodity production and generalized commodity production. And fundamental to this concept of commodity production is the opposition between use value, what he calls use value, and exchange value. What is use value? The use value of a commodity simply refers to the uses or the functions of a commodity, the purpose of using a commodity. Exchange value, on the other hand, finds expression in the form of a price. And in all advanced economies of commodity exchanges, we find the concept of exchange value, which actually replaces the use value of commodities. For Marx, the production of use value of a commodity is a natural human expression. However, according to him, the existence of exchange value sets in motion a process which distorts the entire mechanism of productive activity. However, the entire edifice of the capitalist system, which is comprised of commodities, the market, money, etc., is erected on the basis of exchange value. Next, I move over to another very important concept, which is his explication of the labor theory of value. His entire explanation of capitalism is based on his notion of labor theory of value. What is this labor theory of value? Commodities, he asserts, have only one common feature, which allows their equation and exchange. What is that? It is a social rather than a natural property of a commodity which allows them for equation. And what is that? They're all products of human labor. The value of a commodity is simply a function of the labor that is socially required for their production. So, he says that the economic value of a good or service is determined by the total amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it. In Marxian theory, it is measured simply in terms of the time required to produce it. If I give you an example, this idea will be more clear. The capitalist system is based on this idea of labor giving value to a commodity. And related to this idea of labor theory of value is another concept that I need to mention and explain, which is his notion of surplus value. Apparently, Marx argues that capitalist system is a fair system because here labor is free and the workers are supposed to be paid in proportion to the amount of labor given by them. And yet, Marx asserts that the exploitation in capitalism remains unparalleled as compared to the previous systems of pre-capitalist eras. Now, according to Marx, the main source of this exploitation lies in the generation and extraction of what he calls surplus labor. And we need to understand what is this concept of surplus labor. Surplus labor is basically the value the worker produces in a given period over and above the value of the consumption goods needed to sustain him for that period. Now, I'll give you an example to explain this concept. Marx argues that the capitalist buys labor power at a value, that is, he pays wages which corresponds to the value needed for the workers for their own subsistence. Let's assume that this value is 6 hours of work. With 6 hours of work, a laborer can sustain himself. If he is being able to sustain himself by adding value to the materials by working for 6 hours, then it should be enough. So in other words, if the capitalist employs him for 6 hours, the capitalist would be able to sell the product for just enough to reimburse himself of his outlays. So there will be no profit. So what he does is to extend the working hour. Let us assume that the working day is 12 hours. Then, in the last 6 hours, the worker continues to add value. But now, it is the value over and above that which is necessary to cover his own means of subsistence. And this surplus value is completely pocketed by the capitalist. And now I will talk about another very, very significant concept which he attaches to his idea of capitalism, which is very central to the understanding of capitalism, which is alienation. Marx contends that in capitalism, the nature of exploitation leads to a psychosocial process of alienation among the workers. And the primary factor he identifies for the process of alienation is the objectification of labor. Rather than being an end in itself as an expression of human capabilities and creativity, labor in capitalism is reduced to being a means of simply earning money. Also, because the workers' labor is owned by the capitalist, they get alienated from the productive activity and ultimately they get alienated from their true human nature. I will talk about the 4 major forms of alienation that Marx talks about. alienation from productive activity, alienation from the product of labor, alienation from fellow men, and finally alienation from species being. The first form, alienation from productive activity. Since the workers do not produce objects according to their own ideas or to directly satisfy their own needs, they cannot relate to the productive activity. The entire productive activity is managed and controlled by the capitalist who decides what is to be done and how. Marx also relates this notion of alienation to the division of labor within the capitalist production system, where the workers perform highly specialized tasks and therefore they have little sense of their role in the entire productive activity. The second form that he talks about is alienation from the product. The product of the labor also belongs to the capitalist, not to the workers. The capitalists may use it in a way they wish because it is the capitalist's private property. Hence, there is a feeling of alienation from the product. Also, the specialization of function in capitalist system means that the worker may be producing a very small part of the product on a repetitive mechanical basis, which further alienates him from his product. The third form, alienation from fellow men. For Marx, labor is essentially based on a cooperative relation between fellow human beings. But this relationship of cooperation is completely hampered within the capitalist system. Now, to extract maximum productivity and to prevent the development of cooperative relations, the capitalist pits one worker against the other and thus endangering a relationship of competition or conflict between the workers. And finally, the alienation from species being. And this is the most important form of alienation that he talks about. Workers in capitalist society are alienated from their own human nature. Instead of being a source of transformation and fulfillment of their human nature, the workplace is where the worker feels least human. This is because they are reduced to functioning like machines. What is the definition of class that Marx gives us? According to Marx, the realm of production is central to his understanding of class. He defines class as all those who share same relationship to the mode of production. As I told you, a mode of production comprises of the means of production and the relations of production. In other words, he defines class on the basis of ownership or non-ownership of the means of production. So, for example, in capitalism, it is the capitalists who own the means of production and the proletariat who do not own the means of production. And these are therefore the two fundamental classes in capitalist society. Now, to briefly talk about his idea of development of class consciousness and finally the development of class conflict. Marx believed that all those who share similar class situation will have a common understanding of their shared situation, eventually giving rise to a class consciousness. According to Marx, only when a class becomes conscious of itself as sharing a similar situation, a class, in the real sense of the term, emerges, a social class or what he calls class in itself. He underlines certain stages in the formation of class consciousness and the formation of common activities leading to class struggle. First is that there should be an awareness of the unequal distribution of economic rewards. Also, this has to be facilitated with easy communication between the individuals in the same class position. Eventually, this will give birth to the rise of class consciousness and the feeling of solidarity. Eventually, the emerging dissatisfaction and grievances of those belonging to the same class situation will lead to the establishment of a political organization which will help them to organize a class revolt. Now, when the class consciousness leads a class to enter into an association in an organized pursuit of their common interests, class for itself emerges. Marx believed in the inevitability of the development of class consciousness and the eventual development of class struggle and class revolution in capitalist society. The proletariat as a class holds a special position in Marx's theory of class because it is the only class capable of engaging in political action and bringing about a class revolution. And I conclude, we have basically talked about three aspects of his body of work. First, the philosophy and method of Marxism, that is historical materialism, his understanding of capitalism and some of the important concepts attached to it, and finally his theory of class and class struggle, which is the most significant aspect of his theory of capitalism. The theoretical relevance of Marx's work for the discipline of sociology lies in his contribution to what is called critical theory. He is one of the earliest thinkers to analyze power relations in society, the conflictual relations between classes. Also, his critical theory underlines that it is not only the role of the social scientist to lay bare the existing power structure and power relations, but to embed social analysis with an ideology of emancipation for the oppressed. The emancipatory thrust is unique to the critical paradigm of thought that Marx envisioned. His theoretical framework does not separate fact from value, but rather emphasizes on the need to analyze social reality in relation to an ideological standpoint. Marxism therefore emerges as an oppositional school in relation to positivism, which dominated sociological thinking for a long period of time. With that, I end my today's lecture, and I hope to see you all for my next lecture. Thank you.